Hey, detoxers. In Donald Trump's second term, his Department of Government Efficiency has cut nearly half of the jobs of the Department of Education and cut nearly $1 billion in spending and grants from the Department of Education. This has affected some of the major higher education systems, such as the University of California, which announced a hiring freeze. To help us unpack what this means for faculty and students, not to mention the larger public, is UC-AFT president and lecturer at University of California, Davis. Giddy Rodger, welcome to the Disinfo Detox.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I want to have you on the program because you're in a unique position as my El Presidente to talk about some of these issues. And so, I guess let's start by kind of talking about someone who's a president of a collective bargaining unit of faculty at a time when there are cuts to DOE and future cuts threatened. Talk to us a little bit about what it's like to be in higher ed and what it's like to be the leader of a collective bargaining unit. What's the climate like?
I think it's safe to say that it's kind of a wild time. The word unprecedented has been so overused at this point, but I find it to be quite accurate. It's tough. The truth is that a lot of people are really worried. Things are happening very, very quickly, and it makes for a really challenging situation in terms of being able to support um, faculty who are already dealing with contingency, who are dealing with the stressors of, budget austerity and all of the other things that make our job challenging. Now we have, a whole dimension coming from the federal government that I think is causing a lot of stress and chaos for members and for leaders.
One of the things I wanted to also talk to you about, I think, in this program, we talk a lot about where the media has failed audiences. And one of the popular kind of right-wing criticisms of faculty is that faculty are all these privileged elites who look down on working people. But the type of faculty you represent are different than I think who that trope is targeted
Mhm.
at. And so, can you kind of talk to people who maybe aren't familiar with higher education about this distinction between lecturers and or precarious faculty and I think the tenure track faculty, which most people lob those insults at. Can you kind of talk a little about those
Sure.
differences?
Yeah. So in the University of California, lecturers are precarious contingent faculty just by nature of our job title and our position within the UC. So in our union in UC-AFT, we represent approximately 6 to 7,000 lecturers who are teaching in any given academic year across 10 campuses. And those folks are a majority part-time. They're a majority pre-six or pre-continuing, we call it, which are folks that are early career. So they have much less job stability than people who've been around for a bit longer. But even those folks that have been around longer and have what we call in the UC a continuing appointment, um, even the continuing appointees are still quite precarious. We're subject to layoff for budget cuts, for programmatic change, changes to enrollment. And we've seen in the last academic year, continuing appointees at some UC campuses laid off because of low enrollment, for example. Now, with impending budget cuts, and again, other, kind of austerity setting in, we are very worried about whether the folks in our bargaining unit are going to keep their jobs. And just to round out the answer to your question, all of this is in comparison to folks who are on the tenure track or who already have tenure. In the UC, those are folks in the academic senate, and they are much more secure. They do not find themselves subject to reappointment, which is the process that we go through, where essentially we have to reapply in some cases for our jobs on shorter term contracts. So tenure track folks are in a completely different track, as it really is, that's set up from the start to be far more secure.
Yeah, and so some of our audience may also not know that a lot of these faculty we're talking about, folks who don't have tenure or secure jobs, a lot of these folks end up being so-called freeway flyers, or I used to call them road scholars, meaning that they drive from campus to campus. So they end up teaching, double or sometimes triple what a so-called full-timer
Yep.
makes, right?
Yep. That's completely accurate. And again, within UC-AFT, within the University of California, a majority of lecturers are part-time. We do not have current data, although we'll be collecting it in anticipation of going to the bargaining table in 2026, about how many of our part-timers hold second or third jobs as freeway flyers, or even maybe outside of the education sector. But we know from past campaigns that a majority of that part-time majority are often holding multiple jobs.
Yeah, and because that's one of the things I always sort of found very frustrating about the attacks on higher ed. They talk about these kind of elites in their ivory tower, but a lot of these folks are working double, triple the time, exhausted between campuses, and really, not only for lower wages but less benefits, right? Can you talk a little bit about kind of the benefit disparity as well?
Absolutely. So in the University of California, you have to be at a 50% appointment, FTE, to be benefits eligible. And we have found that, again, a large number, if not a majority, it just depends on the sort of composition of folks in our bargaining unit at any given time. But a large swath of those people are not eligible for health benefits or retirement of any kind. We also know that there are folks who are receiving health benefits as part-timers, but the cost of the employee share of health benefits within the University of California has been going up at a very, very steep rate. 2 years ago, some of the health benefit employee costs went up as much as 300% in one year. And we heard directly from members who had their monthly contribution to their health benefits go up hundreds of dollars per month. And in a couple of cases, people shared that as part-timers, they had been holding on to their UC teaching job because it allowed them to purchase benefits for themselves and their families, and that it was just becoming too expensive to be working in the UC. So, the sort of slogan that emerged organically at that time was, "It costs too much to work for the University of California."
um, Okay, but also I think it's important for audience to know that it wasn't always like this. That this wasn't the case where so many of faculty were in a precarious position, and that they really kind of were the majority of faculty. Can you kind of talk a little bit about that process? Because a lot of, I think, folks have a kind of 1960s vision of higher ed
Yeah.
where it's packed with these tenure track professors who graduate with their PhD and fall right
Mhm.
into a job, and
Mhm.
they get to judge all the people without degrees. But that's not really what's going on, right? Can you talk about how that kind of changed from that sort of way we see higher ed in the 60s to where we are today?
Yeah, it's been a sort of slow roll of defunding and erosion of state and in some cases federal funding, as well as how university systems, including the UC, have allocated money and decreased per student funding for undergraduate education, for example, and it has been writ large across higher ed the case that it has become cheaper for the universities by far to allow their contingent faculty to grow in number. And so there's no incentive whatsoever from certainly a financial perspective to increase the number of tenure track positions, for example. So we find ourselves with larger and larger groups of lecturers in the case of the UC, but whatever they're called, basically adjunct faculty across higher ed. And it's a trend. I mean, there are all kinds of analyses about moments in our political history, in our economic history that have led to where we are now. But it really is a sort of um, mix of all of these types of things. But really, to me, what's important is the will of these organizations, the institutions themselves, has been to capitalize on cheap labor. And they've made conscious choices again and again with how they set up their budgets, how they set up their hiring processes to enable this system to be what it is now.
Yeah, well said on that point. And I think the story you told there about labor getting more precarious and the employer doing everything they can to save money by cutting benefits, cutting wages, cutting hours. I think that's a story that people across the economy, whether they have a college degree or not, are feeling. And you see that in a lot of conversation. So I imagine some people will hear that story and think like, it's interesting the faculty are experiencing these same conditions. But I think they might be shocked to hear that a lot of the work you do, as I understand it, you also work with people who are not academics, right? There's some like union collaboration to other unions that don't solely represent academics. You don't need to necessarily name the specific unions if you don't want to, but can you talk a little bit about that kind of cross pollination of unionization and labor
Mhm.
action?
Yeah, the labor movement is massive. And it does, as you say, it kind of encompasses many different sectors. And I think that what people are brought together around is sort of the so-called gigification of the American workforce, which is absolutely a real phenomenon. And I think you can see it everywhere. In fact, I would imagine that calling higher ed workers gig workers is probably a more recent iteration and use of that concept and phrase, but it absolutely applies. And so, yeah, so coalition building and solidarity across different sectors of labor, I think, is only going to increase as things continue the way they are right now politically in the country. People realize that as workers, running the economy as we do, this is where there is shared power. And I do see that there are efforts right now every day for people to make connections, to build networks, and to think about how we can support each other, even if we're not in, education together, for example, or in the same sector.
Interesting. Okay, so something else I want to talk to you about is, there's been some cuts to DOE and others are being proposed. And as we've talked a lot about on this program, it's hard to even discuss what the supposed cuts are or what Dozier is doing because there's no transparency and there's conflicting messages. So I understand this question is probably going to be difficult to answer with the limited information we get from Elon and his crew there. But what do you anticipate as someone who leads a union? I know you have to kind of guess the unguessable here, but what are you kind of expecting, or what are you discussing or thinking about as conversation of these DOE cuts,
Mhm.
continue?
So I think that there are two ways that we can see direct, sort of immediate impacts coming to higher ed. Um, there are, there's been a lot of discussion and coverage of student loans. So, the fact that so many in higher ed are products of having taken out federal student loans themselves has an immediate impact on people. And there's a lot of fear, obviously, about whether people are going to be able to afford to keep paying their loans, whether they're going to be able to afford to continue to work in education as teachers, higher ed or K-12 even. So there's that immediate discussion that I've definitely seen and heard. But there are other, more adjacent concerns about how this is going to impact undergraduate students and their access to higher education, which ultimately are going to be the people that we're there to teach or not. So I know that there are a lot of concerns right now about even how the financial aid system is going to continue to support undergrads. FAFSA apparently was a mess this year, that sort of thing. Um, Beyond that, I will honestly say that I haven't heard a lot of specifics about how DOE's demise or shrinking size or scope is directly impacting higher ed yet. But I am anticipating that there'll be quite a bit that's revealed soon to us as we really see what that organization ends up looking like. In fact, in the University of California, we've got proposed state cuts coming from the governor's office. And, at this point, still no concrete evidence of federal cuts beyond the general news about NIH and other federal funds. But UC specific funding, no, we don't have concrete information whatsoever. And yet we know that the cuts are coming. We've already seen layoffs of librarians in the University of California. And we are, as we enter right now in the spring into the time of year where lecturers are going to be reappointed for the next year, we absolutely anticipate seeing cuts made in the name of, these upcoming cuts to the UC budget. And I believe that that's how the universe, they're not making this complicated. They're making this simply about expendable labor, which they see lecturers representing.
These questions confronted me a lot more, and maybe you as well. But you get those students in your class that are superstars. They're really interested. They do really well in the discipline you teach or I teach, and then they start talking about how they want to be an academic or they want to go to grad school.
Mm-hmm.
And initially I always supported, yeah, I'll write a letter of rec, I'll help you out, I'll do it. I
Mm-hmm.
found myself adding more qualifiers and more
Yes.
pushback out of care and concern for them, not
Yeah.
for any
Mm-hmm.
other reason. What's your experience with those kind of situations?
Exactly the same. In fact, I'm teaching this quarter. I teach professional writing at UC Davis, which is at the upper division or advanced level. And I'm teaching right now a class full of pre-med students who are getting ready to apply to medical and health science programs. And we talked about the realities of, the fact that we have so many unknowns ahead of us and what graduate school might look like for them. And I found myself really hesitating to be as positive and encouraging as I feel that I've been through I've been a lecturer in the UC system for 15 years. And it's really only up until the last few years that I've had a harder and harder time encouraging students to continue their education, to find that the higher education and post-secondary education in particular could yield a better life and more earning potential and all those things. It's now something that I find myself tripping over with individual students and even in a classroom. And I think that we're not alone. You and I are not alone. I think that this is something happening on a much larger scale, because I think the truth is that not only does this federal administration not value education, but we're clearly seeing evidence that the so-called American public is definitely not pro-education, and so it's hard. I mean, I think it's a really hard place to find yourself in professionally as somebody who I always view myself as a product of all the good things that education can do and be. To not feel as that to not feel as invested in it in that way.
Remember you and I were recently at a conference kind of making small talk, and you mentioned to me kind of the difference in the market from when you sort of originally graduated to what happened
Yeah.
later. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I think that, I wasn't involved in the system at that time you were talking about, but I thought that was very fascinating because I've heard other folks from that era say this. Can you kind of explain what you were talking about there?
You're being so nice about saying that I'm older than you, and yes, I'm happy to speak about that. So yeah, I came out of earning my PhD. I finished my degree in 2010, which was for most of the economy pretty much the tail end of the last recession. Higher ed, however, still had lingering effects. I think it's clear to say everything sort of staggers itself in higher ed. Our budget years tend to reflect the previous year's economic conditions. So in 2010, there were 3 jobs in the Western United States in the field that I was in. I think I shared with you that I'd applied to one of those and learned when I was finally rejected for that job that there'd been nearly 800 applicants for that one position. This was a tenure track position. And certainly things I don't think are at that point now. I think it's come back quite a bit. But I do think that we're already seeing some of the same indicators in higher ed, in the job market in higher ed, that are very, very reminiscent of what was happening in the last recession. Namely, that here we are in the spring, and academic jobs tend to be advertised in the fall and offered in the spring. And what was happening, just in huge numbers during the recession, was that in the spring, all of these jobs that had posted and people had applied for and gone through all of that process were then being canceled at the last minute, saying, no, we're not going to be able to fund this position after all. And I've been hearing anecdotally that this spring people are hearing about jobs that they've applied for that are now being essentially canceled. And I think that that is absolutely an indicator of what's happening and what's probably to come.
Okay, and so for folks out there who maybe I don't know didn't go to college or went to college a long time ago or don't have kids involved in college, so this seems like a kind of foreign concept to you. What are some things you want the public to know about the state of higher education under this current administration?
Well, under this current administration, we're under attack. There's no other way to put it. But I think that now more than ever, we want to encourage people, young people and not so young people, to think about education as a pathway and a viable way to improve their lives. I don't think that has changed. I don't think that actually will change as long as we continue to basically support this kind of higher ed teaching and learning. I think that what I would like for people to know is that we're not a bunch of elites sitting around in an ivory tower. We are workers. We're people who go to work every day. The work, like pretty much anyone in any other part of our economy, is challenging. But for many of us, it's quite rewarding. And we're very dedicated to it. So my hope is that people will see those that work in higher ed as allies in what's going on around us and not removed from it, not, separate from, but very much a part of what we're all experiencing.
Excellent. And for folks out there who may want to learn a little more about what UC-AFT is doing or up to, where are some spots that can follow what's going on?
UC-AFT.org is our website, and our handles are pretty easy to find on Blue Sky and Instagram primarily right now. If you just look up UC-AFT, you'll find us.
Katie, Rodger, you're a great interview. Thank you so much. And thank you all for tuning in to the Disinfo Detox.
Hey, Detoxers. Thanks for tuning in. You can find Disinfo Detox on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget to like, follow, subscribe, and share. Every click helps grow the community and keeps those tech overlords happy. Detox complete.